Welcome to another episode of the Cynical Writer. Today I wanted to talk about 3 pieces of writing advice that I often hear, but I personally don't find very helpful. Now, like all pieces of bad writing advice, there's usually a hint of truth to a lot of them, but oftentimes people take writing advice and they view them as being absolute, or they take them too literally. So the first piece of bad writing advice is to write what you know. Now it really depends on what you mean by write what you know. Writers have to use their imagination if they are going to be creative. They can't always write about experiences that they've had within their own lives. Now that does not mean that they can't write about what they've experienced emotionally. For example, if a writer has experienced depression or anxiety, then they can infuse that within their characters, and that will help the characters come to life. But that doesn't mean that writers always have to write what they know. In fact, I think that if a writer becomes too autobiographical, that shows that they are not being very creative. I hate it when scholarly critics, for example, try to analyze a writer and they say, this character represents their abusive father, or this or that. I mean, I really don't care if a writer is trying to write autobiographically or not. But I just think that writers need to draw, yes, from their own experiences, but also from their own imagination. Otherwise, they're not being very creative. Now, the second piece of bad writing advice that you often hear is, view writing as a business. Now, I think that is absolutely horrible advice. Even though writers engage in business-like transactions, that does not mean that a writer is a business person. A writer is more of an artist, and writers and business people are fundamentally opposed to one another. Now, I know that might sound snobbish, and perhaps it is, but what writers write for their own self-expression. Business people, their primary goal is to make as much money as possible. And though writers would like to make a living with their work, that is not their primary goal. Now, the third piece of bad writing advice is show, don't tell. Now, you hear that quite a lot. Now, it really depends on what you mean by show, don't tell. In the literal sense, all writing is technically telling. But what a lot of people mean when they say show, don't tell is basically be very descriptive, don't be blunt. An example of telling would be Bob walked through the door. An example of showing would be Bob walked through the door, a gentle breeze hitting his face. One is more detailed while the other is more blunt. Now, personally, I love vivid description. That's what I like most about writing. But it really depends on what the scene calls for. If you are writing a scene that is very dramatic and full of emotion, then yes, by all means, show. But if you're just trying to pass along information that is relevant to the plot, then telling is probably the better way to go, because showing is just going to slow you down. So it all depends upon what you're trying to do. Well, that's my perspective for this week. I'll see you again next time. Goodbye.